Resuming debate, reprise de débat. The honourable member for St. Albert, Edmonton.
Well, thank you, Madam Speaker. And first of all, I would like to thank the Minister of Justice and Attorney General of Canada for her thoughtful presentation this morning. The issue of physician-assisted dying is one of the most important social issues that Canada has faced in some time. And, Madam Speaker, there is no question that physician-assisted dying will be one of the most important issues that this Parliament must address. I had the unique opportunity to give special attention to the issue of physician-assisted dying as a Vice Chair of the Special Joint Committee on Physician-Assisted Dying. And I can say that the Special Joint Committee had a very short time period to deal with a highly sensitive and complex issue. And while I, along with my Conservative MP colleagues on the committee, the Honourable Member for Louis St. Laurent, the Member for Langley-Aldergrove, and the Member for Kitchener-Conestoga, were not able to agree with all of the recommendations in the main committee report, I can say that all members from all parties and in both houses worked respectfully and in good faith to do what they believed was best for Canada and respectful of the law arising from the Carter decision. And Madam Speaker, I would particularly like to acknowledge the Honourable Member for Don Valley West, who served ably as chair of the Special Joint Committee. Madam Speaker, the issue of physician-assisted dying raises many deep legal, moral, and ethical questions. It is an issue that Canadians get very emotional about. And that's understandable because when we're talking about physician-assisted dying, we're talking about something that is probably the most important thing to any human being, living and dying, the right to live and the right to die. It is not a new issue to Parliament. Indeed, over the last 25 or so years, this issue has come before Parliament 14 or 15 times. And each time that Parliament was asked the question whether to legalize physician-assisted dying or not, Parliament chose not to. But the issue of whether we should legalize physician-assisted dying or not is over, because the Supreme Court of Canada in Carter determined that physician-assisted dying is a charter right for certain Canadians. And while the Supreme Court recognized that physician-assisted dying is a charter right for certain Canadians, it is important to emphasize that the Supreme Court said that it is a charter right for certain Canadians. The Supreme Court did not say that physician-assisted dying is a charter right to anyone, anytime, anywhere, under any circumstances in Canada. Rather, the Court set out a clear set of parameters. And more specifically, what the Court determined was that competent adult persons who are suffering intolerably from a grievous and irremediable condition and who give their clear consent have a right under Section 7 of the Charter to physician-assisted dying. In so deciding, the Supreme Court sought to strike a balance between, on the one hand, respecting individual autonomy with the need to protect vulnerable persons. And the Supreme Court, Madam Speaker, was satisfied that that balance could be achieved with what the Court characterized in paragraph 105 of its decision as a system of carefully designed and monitored safeguards. So the task before Parliament is to find that balance in the way of a legislative response. As a starting point for a legislative response, it is important to look to the Carter decision. Does the legislation satisfy the parameters of Carter. And, Madam Speaker, I am satisfied that the legislation does satisfy the general parameters of Carter in limiting physician-assisted dying to competent adult persons who are suffering from an incurable disease or illness and in an irreversible state of decline and whose death is foreseeable. That being said, Madam Speaker, I believe that the legislation falls short in at least two regards at this present time. First of all, I'm not satisfied that the legislation sufficiently protects vulnerable persons particularly with underlying mental health challenges. Secondly, I'm disappointed that the legislation does not contain provisions to protect the conscience rights of physicians and allied health professionals. With respect to safeguards, it is true that the legislation limits physician-assisted dying to persons who are suffering from a physical illness. And, Madam Speaker, make no mistake, that is a very important safeguard. And that safeguard, by the way, is consistent with what the Supreme Court pronounced in holding that one has a right to physician-assisted dying in the context of an irremediable condition. Where the legislation, however, falls short is it doesn't take into account persons who have a physical illness on the one hand, but on the other hand suffer from an underlying mental health challenge. And make no mistake about it, if someone has an underlying mental health challenge and they're suffering from a physical illness and they meet all of the criteria of Carter, they have a right to physician-assisted dying, as does every other Canadian who meets that criteria. The issue is ensuring their capacity to consent. And in that regard, it is important to remember, Madam Speaker, that the Supreme Court, as one of the key criterion and the parameters that they set out, said that an individual must give their clear consent. Now, the evidence before the Special Joint Committee is that physicians generally have the training and skill to diagnose someone with an underlying mental health challenge, to identify the underlying mental health challenge. But to take the next step, to undertake the kind of complex analysis of determining capacity and consent, there was a significant amount of evidence that said any physician isn't able to do it. Rather, someone with more specialized training, such as a psychiatrist, is able to undertake that type of assessment. So, Madam Speaker, I would respectfully submit that it would be an improvement, an important improvement in the legislation to contain a safeguard to require a psychiatrist to undertake an evaluation of the patient who is determined to have an underlying mental health challenge, to determine capacity to consent on a decision that is ultimately irreversible. Secondly, Madam Speaker, with respect to conscience protections, I was disappointed that there is no provision for conscience protections in the legislation. Rather, Madam Speaker, this has been passed on to the provinces, to the colleges, to professional regulating bodies. And, Madam Speaker, I believe that the Government of Canada has a duty to protect the conscience rights of physicians and allied health professionals. The conscience rights of physicians are charter rights, and those charter rights are as important as the charter rights of patients to access physician-assisted dying. And the charter rights of physicians with respect to the protection of their conscience and right to conscientious objection is not only any charter right, it is a charter right under Section 2 of the Charter, and Section 2 charter rights are considered to be fundamental freedoms. So, Madam Speaker, I think it is important that the legislation sufficiently respect everyone's charter rights, the charter rights of patients and the charter rights of physicians. And lastly, Madam Speaker, I want to emphasize the importance for the government to respond quickly in the area of palliative care. This is really very critical. It is something that Parliament has talked about for a long time. There have been somewhere in the neighborhood of 4 or 5 Senate committee reports. There was a report out of the House of Commons, at least one. I know that the honourable member for Kitchener-Conestoga had chaired a committee that looked at the issue of palliative care. But now that physician-assisted dying has become a reality, it is time to end the discussion and time to act when it comes to providing access to palliative care. It is widely recognized that palliative care is an essential part of end-of-life decision-making. And one thing that I heard over and over again as a member of the Special Joint Committee was that one cannot truly consent to physician-assisted dying unless they have all options available to them. And Madam Speaker, one of those options is palliative care. But the fact is that only 15 to 30% of Canadians have access to palliative care. And let me say that the option of palliative care without access to palliative care is no option at all. Now, I want to acknowledge that the Minister of Health did announce $3 billion in funding to palliative care, and I think that this is a very important step in the right direction. But it is also noteworthy that there is no mention in the budget of palliative care. There is not one new cent for funding towards palliative care. So it begs the question, where and when is this funding going to come from? And where is it going to go? It is absolutely important that the government take decisive action on palliative care. And so, with that, Madam Speaker, I would say that this legislation is a significant step in the right direction, having regard for some of the recommendations in the Special Joint Committee main report that I believe went beyond the scope of Carter. And I want to thank the government for listening, for considering the dissenting report that was offered by myself as well as my 3 Conservative MP colleagues on the committee. However, it is imperfect legislation. There are some, what I would consider to be significant flaws. I'm hopeful that the government will be amenable as the legislation moves forward to accept amendments so that everyone's charter rights can be respected, the charter rights of patients, the charter rights of physicians and allied health professionals, and the charter rights of vulnerable persons. Thank you, Madam Speaker.
Questions and comments? Questions et commentaires. The honourable member for Miramichi Charleswood, St. James, Assiniboine, Headingley.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. I'd like to thank the honourable member from St. Albert, Edmonton for a impassioned and very principled speech. Now, just from my perspective, the question was brought up as to whether medical practitioners should have the right to exercise their conscience in either performing or referring for this. I've practiced medicine for 20 years. I know the importance of keeping to one's conscience in a medical practice. Another controversial issue in our society is the issue of abortion. There's no legislative protection for physicians that will say that they have the right to refuse to perform abortions or refuse to refer for them. However, no physician in Canada, to my knowledge, has ever been forced to either perform or to perform against one's conscience. I don't know that such legislation is therefore required for the same objection in this.
The honourable member for St. Albert Edmonton.
Well, Madam Speaker, I want to thank my honourable friend across the way for that important question. And I'm concerned that there will be inconsistencies. There already seem to be some inconsistencies with some of the guidelines that have come out of the colleges. I think there is a simple way to address this to ensure that physicians' charter rights are respected. And I think that the federal government can play a role in that end with a fairly simple amendment to the legislation. And I would note, Madam Speaker, that there is a precedent for this type of legislation. It is Section 3 of the Civil Marriage Act, which simply provides that no religious officials may be penalized if they decide not to partake in a civil marriage. So I think that something similar to Section 3 of the Civil Marriage Act could be included in this legislation and would go a long way to ensuring that everyone's charter rights, including those of physicians, are protected.
To remind members that as opposed to shouting out things, to please, if you want to contribute, please stand up and be recognized. So questions and comments, questions et commentaires. The honourable member for Victoria.
Thank you, Madam Speaker, and I'd like to congratulate my colleague from St. Albert Edmonton for a very useful contribution, and in the same spirit with which he contributed so much during the work of the Special Joint Committee on Physician-Assisted Dying, which I had the honour of being part of. And I would like to echo with him his thanks to the member for Don Valley West and also the Senator Ogilvie, who co-chaired that important committee. And I just hope that during this debate we can sustain that same tone of respectful dialogue. He indicated that he was satisfied that Bill C-14 is consistent with the Carter case, and on that point, as I will elaborate, hope later today, I respectfully disagree, but hope we can work together in the Justice Committee to get it right for all Canadians. I was taken with his comments on conscience protection in the legislation, something that just came up as well in the comment from my colleague across the way. In pointing out that it is a charter right for those who have conscience reasons not to participate in medical aid in dying, I think he made an excellent reference to Section 3.1 of the Civil Marriage Act, which requires that there be, which gives a recognition for that conscience protection in that bill. And I guess I'm wondering whether or not it should be appropriate, however, to leave this to the province, because some have said this is a matter, I think the minister made that point as well, of provincial jurisdiction, working with the colleges. But on the other hand, he points out that it involves the charter. And therefore, those individuals who wish to support those rights are going to have to work with 13 other jurisdictions. I'd like the member's comments on whether he thinks that is appropriate.
The honourable member for St. Albert Edmonton.
Well, I want to thank my friend, the honourable member for Victoria, and also acknowledge the important contribution that he made to the Special Joint Committee. His contribution was very valuable. I would just reiterate the point that I previously made, that I do see a need for consistency, and that can be done in the way of a simple amendment to the legislation. On the issue of jurisdiction, I would note that in the Carter decision, the Supreme Court expressly recognized that health care is an area of concurrent jurisdiction, so I believe that there is ample room jurisdictionally for the government to act in this regard.
Questions and comments, questions et commentaires. The Honourable Minister of Foreign Affairs.
No, Parliamentary.
Oh, sorry. Parliamentary Secretary to the Minister of Foreign Affairs.
Thank you very much, Madam Speaker, and thank you very much to the honourable member from St. Pardon me? Okay. Oh, thank you. Thank you very much to the members across the aisle. And thank you to the honourable member from St. Albert Edmonton for his service on the Special Joint Committee. I'm very interested in the questions that we are going to ask ourselves as Canadian society in the future, and I'm interested in his views on advanced consent, consent for mature minors, and eligibility based solely on mental illness. Thank you.
The honourable member for Edmonton, for St. Albert Edmonton.
Madam Speaker, I believe that any legislative response needs to adhere to the parameters of Carter. And what the Supreme Court said with respect to minors is the Supreme Court said competent adult persons. If the Supreme Court contemplated minors, the Supreme Court would have said so, but the Supreme Court did not say that. They were very clear in saying competent adult persons. Similarly, with respect to advanced directives, the Supreme Court said that persons who are suffering intolerably from a grievous and irremediable condition have a right to physician-assisted dying, not persons who anticipate that they will suffer from a grievous and irremediable condition. I would also note that in the province of Quebec, which passed Bill 52, over the course of, by the way, 6 years, 3 national assemblies, and 3 different governments, that advanced directives were initially in the first draft of Bill 52, but they were ultimately removed from the legislation when it was passed by the Quebec National Assembly because legislators in Quebec were not satisfied that advanced directives could be incorporated into the legislation without mitigating significant risks. And lastly, Madam, okay, thank you.
Questions and comments, questions et commentaires. The honourable member for Sherwood Park, Fort Saskatchewan.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. I thank the member for his remarks and the good work he did on the committee, and to some extent the brave face he's putting on its work. Of course, members worked hard on that committee, but we're aware of the problems in the process as well. The fact that we heard from 3 separate panels from the lobby group Dying with Dignity. We didn't hear from any anti-euthanasia advocacy group there. But I want to just follow up on the question about conscience, because I think we had some misinformation from the other side. The reality is that right now in Ontario, the policy of the College of Physicians and Surgeons is that there is a requirement not only to refer, but also to provide services that are within the standard of care in an emergency situation. So members from other provinces, I'm not from Ontario either, but members from other provinces should know that that is presently the reality in Ontario. So if we pass this legislation without conscience protection, presumably euthanasia, assisted suicide enter the standard of care and are then fit within that existing framework of the College of Physicians and Surgeons in Ontario policy. We might hope that they might change the policy or create special accommodations, but in the absence of that, that will be the reality right away. So I want to know what the member thinks about that and maybe just underline why conscience is important because of the current reality in Ontario and the need for consistency across the country.
The honourable member for St. Albert Edmonton.
Well, I want to thank my colleague, the member for Sherwood Park, Fort Saskatchewan, for that question. I do not support an effective referral regime. I believe that an effective referral regime would contravene Section 2 of the Charter, and I would also note that there is no jurisdiction in the world that has an effective referral regime, not Belgium, not the Netherlands, not any of the U.S. states that have physician-assisted dying, and not the province of Quebec.
We have time for a very, very brief question. Questions and comments. Questions et commentaires. The honourable member, Minister of Justice.
Thank you, Madam Speaker, and I would like to thank my honourable colleague across the way for his work on the Special Joint Committee and certainly for your speech today. I appreciate the discussion around conscience rights of medical practitioners and institutions, and wondered if my friend had any comments on the Canadian Medical Association's agreement with respect to the legislation and not advocating a worry with respect to conscience rights. And then also I just wanted to know if my friend...
I'm sorry. We only had time for a brief question, so we need an answer. The honourable member for St. Albert Edmonton.
Well, Madam Speaker, first of all, there are a number of physicians, a large number of physicians who have raised this issue, and I think Parliament owes it to them to address the issue. I agree with the Minister of Justice and Attorney General that it is absolutely imperative, absolutely essential that Parliament pass legislation before the declaration on the stay of constitutional invalidity expires on June 6.
Statements by members.